There are moments in life when something small happens, and it stays with you for hours. Someone says something, a comment, a look, a message that came too late or never came at all. And even though you know it shouldn't matter, it does. It sits in your chest. It follows you through the day. It replays in your mind when everything else has gone quiet. You've felt this before. Maybe someone at work dismissed your idea in front of others, and you smiled and moved on. But inside, something tightened. Something that didn't let go. Maybe you tried hard at something, gave it everything you had, and then someone looked at it and shrugged. And that shrug reached somewhere deep. Maybe someone you care about said something careless. They didn't even mean it the way it landed. But it landed hard. And you spent the rest of the day wondering why you couldn't just shake it off. This is not weakness. This is not a flaw. This is what it feels like to be a person who feels things deeply. But there is a difference between feeling something and being consumed by it. There is a difference between being affected and being controlled. And most people, somewhere between childhood and adulthood, were never taught how to hold that difference. So instead, they learned to carry everything. They carried every criticism like a verdict, every silence like a rejection, every mistake like proof of something being wrong with them, every difficult person like a problem that needed to be fixed before they could feel okay again. You might recognize this pattern in yourself, not because you are broken, but because no one ever showed you another way. Most people were told to toughen up, to stop being so sensitive, to not let things get to them, as if emotional pain were simply a choice to be made and unmade, as if you could just decide one day to stop caring and caring would stop. It doesn't work that way. You already know it doesn't work that way. What actually happens when you tell yourself not to feel something is that the feeling goes quiet. For a little while, it retreats. It stops being visible, but it doesn't leave. It settles somewhere deeper. It accumulates. And over time, things that should feel small start to feel enormous. Things that should pass quickly seem to linger. And you begin to wonder if something is wrong with you. Nothing is wrong with you. What is happening is that your emotional world has been reacting without the tools it needs to process. Your nervous system has been absorbing everything, every slight, every disappointment, every moment of uncertainty, without a safe place to put it. And so everything gets mixed together, old wounds and new ones, real threats and imagined ones, important things and unimportant things. They all feel the same. This audiobook is about learning to tell the difference. It is about understanding why certain things affect you the way they do, why certain people can say one sentence and reach something in you that others cannot, why rejection feels like loss, why criticism feels like attack, why silence can feel louder than words. And then, once you understand why, this audiobook is about learning how to change your relationship with those things, not by feeling less, not by building walls, not by pretending that difficult moments don't exist, but by learning to remain steady inside them. There is a version of you that can hear criticism without being dismantled by it. That can sit with disappointment without spiraling. That can be around difficult people without absorbing their energy like a sponge. That can receive pressure without cracking under it. That version of you is not cold, not numb, not distant. That version of you is grounded. Groundedness is not the absence of feeling. It is the ability to feel something without immediately being carried away by it. It is the capacity to notice what is happening inside you and choose, consciously, deliberately, how you want to respond. Right now, most people do not choose their responses. They react. Something happens, and the reaction follows almost automatically, like a reflex. The gap between stimulus and response is so small that it barely feels like a gap at all. But that gap exists, and the work of this audiobook is to help you find it, widen it, and live inside it. Because in that gap, between what happens to you and how you respond, is where your freedom lies. You cannot control everything that happens around you. You cannot stop people from being unkind. You cannot prevent failure. You cannot guarantee that life will move smoothly. You cannot protect yourself from every disappointment. But you can learn to stop giving every single thing the power to control your internal world. That is not indifference. That is not detachment. That is not hardness. That is emotional mastery. And it begins not with strength, but with understanding. So let's begin there. With understanding, with honesty, with the question that most people are too busy managing to ever really ask. Why do things affect you so deeply in the first place? To understand why things affect you so deeply, you have to be willing to look honestly at something most people would rather avoid. The reason so many external events feel personal is not simply because the world is harsh. It is because somewhere inside you, beneath your confidence, beneath your competence, beneath the version of yourself you present to the world, there is a part of you that is still waiting for proof. Proof that you are good enough. Proof that you belong. Proof that your effort matters. Proof that you are valued. And because that proof is constantly being sought, every external event becomes a source of evidence. When someone approves of you, it feels like confirmation. When someone criticizes you, it feels like exposure. When someone ignores you, it feels like erasure. When someone challenges you, it feels like a threat to the version of yourself you have worked so hard to build. This is not vanity. This is not weakness. This is what happens when your sense of self is tied to what the world reflects back at you. Most people's self-worth was formed in relationship to others. As children, you learned whether you were acceptable based on how people responded to you, the praise you received, the corrections, the love that was given freely, and the love that had to be earned, the moments of being seen and the moments of being overlooked. These early experiences did not just shape your memories, they shaped the invisible framework through which you now interpret everything. If you learned, even subtly, that approval had to be earned, that you were only acceptable when you performed correctly, then your nervous system adapted. It became very good at reading rooms, very sensitive to shifts in tone, very attuned to the difference between being included and being excluded. And when that sensitivity goes into adulthood without awareness, it creates a life in which almost everything feels like it is about you. The colleague who doesn't smile when they walk past you. The friend who replies with a shorter message than usual. The person in a meeting who questions your idea. The silence after you share something vulnerable. These things hit differently when your nervous system has learned to interpret them as signals. Not signals about the other person's mood or their own preoccupations or their own limitations, but signals about you, about your worth, about whether you are safe. And here is where the emotional weight accumulates, because when you are in a constant state of reading the world for evidence of your value, you are living in a kind of low-level vigilance. You are always monitoring, always evaluating, always measuring the temperature of the room. And that is exhausting in a way that is hard to articulate, because it is invisible. It happens beneath the surface of daily life, quietly draining your reserves. The other reason everything feels personal is attachment. You care deeply about your work, your relationships, your reputation, your goals. Caring is not the problem. Caring is human. Caring is what makes things meaningful. The problem arises when caring becomes clinging, when the outcomes of things you care about start to feel like reflections of who you are, when your project isn't just a project, it is your competence on display, when your relationship isn't just a relationship, it is the proof that you are lovable, when your goal isn't just a goal, it is the condition you have placed on your own sense of worthiness. When the stakes feel that high, every setback feels catastrophic, every criticism feels devastating. Every moment of uncertainty feels threatening. Because what is really at stake, in your mind, is not just the thing, it is you. Understanding this does not mean detaching from the things you care about. It means learning to separate your worth from the outcome, learning to care deeply without making every result a referendum on your value as a person. That separation is difficult. It takes time. It takes practice. But it begins with recognizing that you have been doing it, unconsciously, automatically, for most of your life. There is also something worth naming here, and that is the role of validation. You have probably been taught that needing validation is something to be ashamed of. That healthy, self-sufficient people don't need others to tell them they are doing well. That wanting recognition is a sign of insecurity. But wanting to be seen, acknowledged, and appreciated is not a flaw. It is a need. It is a deeply human need. The problem is not having the need. The problem is when that need becomes so large, so central to your functioning, that your emotional stability rises and falls with whether or not it is being met. When you need a certain person to respond a certain way for you to feel okay, you have handed them control over your internal state. When you need a project to succeed for you to feel worthy, you have made your worth conditional. When you need life to be fair for you to feel safe, you have made your safety dependent on something that cannot be guaranteed. This is not a character flaw. It is a pattern. And patterns can be changed. The change begins with something simple, though not always easy. It begins with the slow, steady work of building a self that does not depend on the external world to remain standing. Not a self that is closed off. Not a self that is impervious. But a self that is rooted deeply enough that when the wind moves through, and it will always move through, you bend, but you do not break. That rootedness is what the rest of this audiobook is about. But first, you need to understand the specific ways your emotional system gets pulled off center. You need to understand your triggers. Not to fear them, not to be ashamed of them, but to know them so well that they lose the power to surprise you. A trigger is not a dramatic thing. A trigger is simply a moment when something external makes contact with something internal, and the reaction that follows is larger than the situation alone would seem to warrant. You say something mildly critical to a friend, and they go completely silent for 3 days. A stranger cuts you off in traffic, and you feel a surge of anger that stays with you for an hour. Your boss gives you feedback on your work, and your stomach drops as if something terrible has just happened. Your partner uses a slightly different tone of voice, and suddenly you feel the ground shift beneath you. In each of these situations, the external event is real, but the intensity of the response, the size of the reaction relative to the scale of the event, is coming from somewhere else. It is coming from history, from memory, from old pain that never fully resolved. This is what a trigger really is. It is not just a response to the present. It is the past being activated by the present. And when you understand this, something important shifts. You stop being only a victim of your reactions and start becoming someone who can observe them. Your nervous system is an extraordinary instrument. It is constantly scanning your environment for signals of safety and threat. And it does this not just based on objective facts, but based on learned associations, based on experience. If you grew up in an environment where criticism was often followed by punishment, your nervous system learned to associate criticism with danger. And so today, when someone offers even mild criticism, your nervous system may respond as though danger is present. Not because you have consciously decided to overreact, but because the body acts faster than thought. If you experienced rejection or abandonment at a formative age, and it doesn't have to be dramatic rejection, it can be as subtle as a parent who was emotionally unavailable or a friendship that ended abruptly, your system may have learned to scan constantly for signs that rejection is coming again. So a text that goes unanswered, or a friend who seems slightly more distant than usual, can activate a response that feels entirely disproportionate to anyone watching from the outside. But from the inside, the response feels completely proportional, because the inside is not responding to just this moment. It is responding to every time before. This layering of past pain onto present experience is one of the most important things to understand about your own emotional life. Because without this understanding, you will spend enormous energy trying to change your reactions and wondering why you cannot. You will tell yourself to calm down, and your body will refuse. You will tell yourself it's not a big deal, and your nervous system will insist that it is. The nervous system does not respond to logic. It responds to safety. And safety, for the nervous system, is learned. So where do triggers come from? Specifically, many of your most sensitive triggers are connected to your core emotional needs. Every person has them. The need to feel valued, to feel safe, to feel capable, to feel loved, to feel free, to feel respected. These are not luxuries. They are fundamental. When one of these needs was repeatedly threatened or unmet in your early life, it created what might be called a wound. Not necessarily a dramatic wound, not necessarily something that defines you as damaged, just an area of particular sensitivity, a place inside you that never quite healed all the way, and that area remains sensitive. So when the present world touches it, even lightly, the pain that comes up is not just from now. It is from then, too. Think about the things that affect you most deeply. Not the things that bother everyone, but the specific things that bother you in particular. The things that seem to reach past your composure and get into something deeper. Maybe it is being overlooked. Perhaps you are someone for whom invisibility is a particular kind of pain. When you speak and no one responds. When you contribute and your contribution is not acknowledged. When you try hard and no one seems to notice. If this is a deep trigger for you, it is likely connected to a time, or many times, when being seen felt conditional or uncertain. Maybe your deepest trigger is criticism, not just sharp or unkind criticism, but even gentle, constructive feedback. If criticism immediately activates shame or defensiveness, it may be because criticism once came attached to withdrawal of love. Because once upon a time, being wrong felt like being unworthy, and your nervous system still makes that connection. Maybe your trigger is being controlled or constrained. Any situation in which you feel your freedom is being taken away, in which someone is telling you what to do, or how to be, or what is right, immediately creates something that feels like rebellion or panic. If that is true for you, it may connect to an early experience of not being trusted with your own choices or of having your autonomy regularly overridden. Maybe your deepest trigger is uncertainty. You function well when things are clear, predictable, and defined. But the moment the future becomes unclear, a relationship that is ambiguous, a job situation that is uncertain, a plan that has no guaranteed outcome, anxiety rises and the mind begins to churn. Uncertainty as a trigger often connects to early experiences in which the environment was unpredictable, where you never quite knew what to expect. And so the nervous system learned that unpredictability means threat. Knowing your triggers is not about assigning blame. It is not about deciding that your past has permanently determined your present. It is about giving yourself information. Because you cannot work with something you cannot see, most people walk through life with their triggers operating entirely underground. They don't understand why certain things affect them so much. They just know that some things hit hard and they can't explain it. And not being able to explain it often makes it worse. Because on top of the emotional pain, there is also confusion and shame. A sense of why can't I just handle this? You can handle it, but handling it begins with understanding it. There is also something important about the physical dimension of triggers that is worth exploring here. Because triggers are not just emotional, they are somatic. They live in the body. When a trigger is activated, the body responds before the mind has processed what is happening. The chest tightens, the stomach clenches, the shoulders rise, the throat constricts, the jaw locks, breathing becomes shallow, the heart rate increases. These are not just metaphors for emotion. These are real physical responses. The same responses your body produces when it perceives genuine danger. Fight, flight, freeze. And the critical point is this: in that state, your thinking changes. You lose access to the parts of your brain that help you reason, perspective, take, regulate, and respond thoughtfully. The rational mind becomes less available, and the reactive, survival-oriented mind takes over. This is why you can know, intellectually, that something is not a big deal and still be completely unable to behave as though it isn't. Because the intellectual knowing and the body's response are operating on different tracks. And in a triggered state, the body usually wins. So what do you do with this? The first and most important step is recognition, learning to notice, early, before the reaction has fully taken hold, that a trigger is being activated. You will not always catch it in time. At first, you may only recognize it after the fact, when you are looking back at a reaction and wondering where it came from. That is still valuable. That is still data. With practice, you begin to catch it earlier. You start to notice the body signals before the reaction escalates. The tightening in your chest, the shift in your breathing, the feeling of something pulling inward. These are signals, and when you learn to read them, you gain a critical advantage, because in the moment of recognition, in that small moment between the trigger being activated and the reaction taking over, there is a choice. Not always a large choice, not always an easy one, but a choice. And that is where your freedom lies. Recognizing a trigger does not mean the feeling disappears. It means you are no longer at its mercy. You can feel the tightening in your chest and say, internally, I notice this. I know what this is. I do not have to be governed by it right now. That is not suppression. That is awareness. And awareness is the beginning of everything. If triggers are the spark, overthinking is the fuel. There is a process that happens in the mind after something difficult occurs, and most people are so familiar with it that they barely notice it as a separate thing. Something happens, and then the mind takes that thing and begins to work on it, turning it over, examining it from every angle, replaying the moment, imagining what comes next, constructing scenarios, building narratives. And each time the mind runs the loop, the original experience gets a little larger, a little heavier, a little more certain in its worst interpretation. This is overthinking. Not thinking carefully about something. Not reflecting thoughtfully in order to understand, but the involuntary, compulsive replaying of an experience in a way that does not produce clarity or resolution, only more pain. You already know what overthinking feels like from the inside. A conversation that ended awkwardly, and then 3 hours of mental reconstruction trying to figure out what you said wrong. An email that came with a shorter reply than usual, and then an afternoon of wondering what it means. A moment of tension with someone you love, and then a night of imagining everything that could unravel from it. Overthinking takes something that happened in the space of a few seconds and stretches it across hours, days, sometimes weeks. It turns a single experience into an entire landscape of suffering. And the cruelest part of overthinking is that it feels productive. It feels like you are doing something. It feels like you are working through the problem, getting closer to answers, preparing yourself for possibilities. But in reality, most overthinking is not problem solving. It is emotional pain that has taken on the appearance of thinking. It is anxiety wearing a disguise. Let's trace how this process actually works, because seeing it clearly is one of the most powerful things you can do. Something happens. Let's say someone you care about responds to a message you sent with unusual brevity. 2 words where normally they would write more. Your mind registers this, and instead of holding it lightly, instead of simply noticing it and moving on, the mind begins to construct. Why did they respond that way? Are they upset? Did I say something? Did I do something? Maybe it was last week when I said that thing. Maybe they took it the wrong way. Or maybe it's not about me at all. Maybe something is happening with them. But then why wouldn't they say something? Maybe they don't feel comfortable with me anymore. Maybe I've been too much. Maybe I've been too distant. Maybe the friendship is changing, and within a few minutes, without any new information, without any actual events, you have constructed an entire narrative, a story of something going wrong. And because you have constructed it, it begins to feel real, not as a possibility, but as a likelihood, sometimes as a certainty. This is the amplification process. The mind takes a single data point, a two-word message, and extrapolates from it a world of meaning, and that constructed world becomes the source of real emotional pain. You are not imagining the pain. The pain is real, but the cause of the pain is not the two-word message. The cause of the pain is the story the mind built around it. This distinction matters enormously, because if the pain is caused by the story, then the pain can be addressed by examining the story, by questioning it, by recognizing it as a construction rather than a fact. Why does the mind do this? Why does overthinking happen at all? Part of the answer is biological. The human brain is wired for pattern recognition and threat detection. It evolved in an environment where missing a threat was far more costly than imagining a threat that wasn't there. So, the default setting of the mind is to err on the side of danger, to assume the worst when information is ambiguous, because assuming the worst and being wrong is survivable. Being caught off guard by actual danger is not. This made sense for a very long time. In a world of physical threats, a hair-trigger threat response was an advantage. But in the modern world, where most of your threats are social and psychological, not physical, that same mechanism creates suffering. The mind identifies an ambiguous social signal and immediately runs toward the worst interpretation, not because it is right, but because it is trying to protect you. The other reason overthinking happens is because of unresolved emotional needs. When there is something you need, certainty, reassurance, resolution, control, and that need is not being met, the mind continues to churn, trying to think its way to a solution, trying to figure out how to make the need get met. But some needs cannot be met through thinking, and the more the mind churns in search of resolution that thinking cannot provide, the more activated the emotional system becomes. There is something else that fuels overthinking, and it is worth naming because it is often overlooked. It is the belief that thinking hard enough about something will give you control over it. If you think through every possible outcome, you will be prepared. If you replay the conversation enough times, you will understand what went wrong. If you imagine every scenario, nothing will surprise you. If you analyze the problem thoroughly enough, you will find the answer. This belief is not irrational. Understanding does lead to some degree of mastery. Preparation does reduce some forms of risk. But there are vast territories of life that cannot be controlled through thinking. The inner worlds of other people, the unpredictability of the future, the way relationships evolve, the outcomes of effort, the way life moves. And when the mind tries to use thinking to control the uncontrollable, it spins, not forward, not toward resolution, but in circles, returning again and again to the same unanswerable questions, wearing grooves into the same thoughts until they become automatic, and every loop increases the emotional charge. Every repetition adds weight. What began as a mild unease becomes anxiety. What began as hurt becomes grief. What began as a passing frustration becomes something that feels immovable. This is what emotional amplification means. The original event was not small, but it was also not as large as it has become in your internal experience. The gap between what happened and how it now feels has been filled entirely by what the mind did with it afterward. So what is the alternative? If not thinking, then what? The first thing is to recognize the difference between productive reflection and circular overthinking. Productive reflection moves. It generates new understanding. It leads somewhere. It helps you decide how to act. Overthinking returns. It visits the same territory again and again. It produces feeling, not clarity. When you notice your mind running the same loop for the third time, the fourth time, without reaching a different conclusion, that is a signal not to think harder, to stop thinking and to feel. Because often, what is driving the overthinking is not a need for information. It is a need to process the feeling underneath, anxiety that has not been acknowledged, hurt that has not been allowed, fear that has been converted into analysis because analysis feels safer than fear. When you turn toward the feeling, when you let yourself actually feel the anxiety or the hurt or the fear, something interesting happens. The mind slows down, because the mind was using overthinking as a substitute for feeling. And when the feeling is actually felt, when it is acknowledged and allowed to be what it is, the thinking loop loses its urgency. This is not something that happens once and solves the problem forever. It is a practice, a constant turning back toward the present moment and the actual feeling, rather than the constructed story about the feeling. It also helps to notice your relationship with uncertainty. Most overthinking is an attempt to eliminate uncertainty, to answer the question before it can answer itself, to resolve the ambiguity before it has time to develop. But life is irreducibly uncertain. You will never have all the information. You will never be able to control every variable. The future will always contain the unknown. And the more you try to think your way to certainty, the more exhausting and impossible the task becomes. Because certainty is not available through thinking. It is found in something different. It is found in trust, in your own capacity to handle whatever comes, in the understanding that you do not need to know everything in advance in order to be okay. You have navigated uncertainty before. Things have been unresolved before. The thing you were afraid of happened, or it didn't. And either way, you survived. Either way, you found a way through. You will do it again. And when you begin to trust that, not as a performance of confidence, but as a genuine recognition of your own resilience, the grip of overthinking begins to loosen. Not because the uncertainty disappears, but because you stop needing it to. There is a moment, and you have experienced it, when something happens and you feel it move through your whole body before your mind has had time to form a single thought. Someone says something cutting, and your chest fills with heat before you have named it as anger. Your phone shows a certain name, and your stomach drops before you have formed a reason why. You walk into a room and something shifts in the atmosphere, and you feel it in your skin before you understand it in your mind. Feeling is immediate. Feeling is honest. Feeling is the body's language for something that is happening in your world. And feeling is not the problem. The problem is what comes next, because in most people's experience, feeling is not followed by a pause. Feeling is followed, almost simultaneously, by reacting. And reacting is different from responding. Reacting is automatic. It is fast. It is driven by the feeling rather than by conscious choice. And it often makes things worse. You feel hurt and you say something sharp. You feel rejected and you withdraw. You feel overlooked and you become quietly resentful. You feel threatened and you become defensive. You feel anxious and you try to control something. You feel overwhelmed and you shut down. These reactions are not wrong. They are understandable. They are human. They are the result of a nervous system trying to protect itself in the best way it knows how. But they are not always effective, and they are almost never fully chosen. The gap between feeling and reacting is the space where emotional intelligence lives. It is also the space that most people have not been taught to inhabit. Think about what it would mean to inhabit that space. Something happens. You feel it. You feel it fully. The tightening, the heat, the drop in the stomach, the particular quality of this specific emotion in this specific moment. You do not push it away. You do not perform calm over the top of it. You feel it. And then, before you act, you pause. Not a long pause, just a moment. A breath. Enough space to notice I am feeling this. This is anger, or hurt, or fear or shame. This feeling is real. This feeling is mine. And now, how do I want to respond? That question, how do I want to respond, is one of the most powerful questions you can learn to ask, because it takes the process of response, making out of the automatic, and places it, however briefly, into the conscious. It doesn't guarantee a perfect response. It doesn't eliminate the possibility of saying the wrong thing, but it creates the possibility of a chosen response. And a chosen response, even an imperfect one, is categorically different from an automatic reaction. This is what emotional awareness actually means in practice. Not the elimination of feeling, not the performance of calm, but the development of a relationship with your own inner world that is spacious enough to include feeling without being swallowed by it. Let's look more carefully at what gets in the way of this gap. The first barrier is speed. Reactions happen fast. The emotional response is activated, and the behavioral response follows before the thinking mind has entered the conversation. By the time you have any awareness of what is happening, you have already said the thing, or withdrawn, or escalated. Speed is not fully controllable, but speed can be addressed through the practice of pausing. When you make a deliberate practice of pausing, even briefly, even imperfectly, before responding in emotionally charged situations, you are training yourself to create that gap. At first it will be small. The pause will happen after you have already reacted. That is still useful. The moment you can notice "I just reacted" rather than "I just responded" is a moment of awareness. It is the beginning. With practice, the pause moves earlier. You begin to notice the activation before the reaction. You catch yourself mid-sentence and redirect. Eventually, not always, but more often, you notice before you speak, before you act, before the automatic response takes hold. The second barrier is the belief that feeling and reacting are the same thing. That if you feel angry, you must express that anger immediately. That if you feel hurt, you must withdraw. That if you feel fear, you must flee. This belief is understandable. Many people grew up in environments where emotions and actions were directly linked, where feeling something meant doing something about it immediately, where sitting with a feeling without acting on it felt intolerable because no one had modeled what that looks like. But feeling and acting are not the same thing. You can feel angry without being violent or cruel. You can feel hurt without disappearing. You can feel fear without running. You can feel the full weight of an emotion without the emotion dictating your behavior. Emotions are information. They are telling you something about your experience, your needs, your values, your boundaries. That information is valuable. It deserves to be heard, but hearing it does not mean letting it drive. The third barrier is the way strong emotions narrow your perspective. When you are in a triggered emotional state, your field of vision shrinks. Your brain's capacity for nuance, for seeing multiple sides, for imagining consequences, for accessing empathy, all of it contracts. The world becomes very immediate, very black and white, very here and now. This is a biological feature, not a flaw. In a genuine emergency, narrow focus is useful. You don't need to consider multiple perspectives when you need to move quickly. But in most of the situations that trigger you, a difficult conversation, a critical comment, a moment of rejection, you are not in a genuine emergency. The narrowing of perspective does not serve you, and the responses it produces, sharp, certain, defensive, absolute, often create more problems than the original situation. Recognizing this narrowing is part of what makes the pause so valuable. Because in the pause, there is the possibility of asking, is this as absolute as it feels right now? Is there something I'm not seeing? What would I think about this in an hour or tomorrow? The answers to those questions may not change what you decide to do, but they might change how you do it. And the how matters enormously. There is something else worth exploring here, and that is the role of self-compassion in building this gap. Many people find it difficult to develop the capacity for pausing and choosing because they are simultaneously flooded by the emotion and criticizing themselves for having it. They feel hurt, and then they feel ashamed of feeling hurt. They feel angry, and then they judge themselves for the anger. They feel afraid, and then they tell themselves they should not be afraid. This double layer of experience, the primary emotion and the judgmental response to the emotion, uses up the very resources you need for the pause. It makes the internal space even more crowded, even more chaotic, and it makes the likelihood of a reactive response even higher. Self-compassion is not a soft idea. It is not weakness or self-indulgence. It is the recognition that having feelings is part of being human, that you are not broken for feeling what you feel, that the presence of an emotion does not make you a bad person. When you can hold your own emotional experience with gentleness, when you can say, internally, of course this hurts, this is a hard thing, something remarkable happens. The intensity softens, not because you are dismissing the feeling, but because you are no longer fighting it. You are allowing it, and what is allowed to exist without resistance tends to move through more quickly than what is suppressed or shamed. This is the paradox at the heart of emotional regulation. The emotions you fight tend to stay. The emotions you allow tend to pass. So feel. Feel fully and honestly. Feel without judgment. Let the feeling be what it is. And then, in the space that awareness creates, ask yourself how you want to move forward. Not how your fear would move forward. Not how your hurt would move forward. Not how your defensiveness would move forward. How you, the self that is larger than any single feeling, how you want to move forward. That self is always there, even when it is hard to access, even when the feeling is loud and the reaction is close. That larger, quieter, steadier self is always available, and the more you practice turning toward it, the more natural it becomes. Emotional stability is not a destination. It is not a state you arrive at once and then maintain forever. It is something you build, slowly, continuously, through daily practice and self-awareness and the accumulated wisdom of every time you have moved through something difficult. But it helps to understand what stability is made of, because many people associate stability with having everything in order, with having resolved all the things that used to bother them, with having reached a place of such security that nothing can threaten it. That is not what stability is. Stability is not the absence of turbulence. It is the capacity to remain oriented through turbulence. Think of a tree in wind. The tree does not resist the wind by becoming rigid. Rigidity would cause it to break. The tree bends. The branches move. The leaves shake. And when the wind passes, the tree is still standing, still rooted, still oriented toward light. This is the model for emotional stability. Not immovability, not imperviousness, but rootedness. The kind of inner structure that allows you to bend without breaking, to be moved without being swept away, to feel without losing your footing. How do you build that structure? The first component is self-knowledge, and by this we mean something more specific than knowing your personality or your preferences. We mean knowing your emotional landscape with enough clarity and honesty that you are no longer surprised by it. You know which situations tend to activate you. You know the specific flavors of pain that are most familiar to you. You know the patterns your mind falls into under stress. You know the physical sensations that signal you are moving toward overwhelm. This knowing is protective, because when you know the territory, you are not caught off guard. And when you are not caught off guard, you have more access to your capacity to choose. Self-knowledge also includes knowing what you actually need in difficult moments. This sounds simple, but is often neglected. When you are struggling, what genuinely helps? Solitude, movement, connection, expression, rest. Different people need different things, and the same person needs different things at different times. Learning to identify and honor your own genuine needs, rather than reaching for whatever habit of coping is most automatic, is a form of self-care that has direct impact on your emotional stability. Because when your needs are being met, your threshold for being destabilized is higher. And when your needs are being ignored or suppressed, even small things can crack you. The second component of stability is self-trust. Self-trust is the confidence that whatever happens, you will be able to handle it. Not handle it perfectly. Not handle it without feeling anything. But move through it. Find a way. Come out the other side. Most people underestimate their own resilience because they are so focused on what they haven't survived perfectly that they lose sight of everything they have survived at all. You have already moved through things that once seemed impossible. You have already survived versions of fear and loss and disappointment and uncertainty that you did not know you could survive, and yet here you are. That history is not nothing, it is evidence. Evidence of your own capacity. And when you can access that evidence, when you can remind yourself in difficult moments that you have navigated hard things before, it shifts something fundamental in your relationship to the present difficulty. It stops being an unsurvivable catastrophe and starts being something hard that you are moving through. Self-trust also means trusting your judgment. Many people who find themselves easily affected by others' opinions have learned, somewhere along the way, to distrust their own. They have been taught, explicitly or implicitly, that their perceptions are not reliable, that their feelings cannot be trusted, that they need external input to know what is real or true. When you learn to trust your own perceptions, to take your own experience seriously, to believe that what you see and feel is meaningful, you become less dependent on external validation for your sense of reality, and that reduces an enormous source of vulnerability. The third component is boundaries. Boundaries are not walls. They are not defenses. They are not ways of shutting people out. They are definitions of what you will and will not accept in your own life. They are the expression of self-respect in practice. People who do not have clear boundaries tend to absorb everything, every opinion, every expectation, every demand, every emotional state of every person around them, without a clearly defined sense of what belongs to them and what belongs to others. The emotional space becomes impossibly crowded. Having a boundary means knowing the difference between your emotional responsibility and someone else's. It means recognizing that you cannot be responsible for how other people feel about every choice you make. That you cannot control whether someone is disappointed in you, or angry at you, or misunderstands you. You can be thoughtful. You can be kind. You can do your honest best. But other people's reactions to your choices are their responsibility, not yours. This distinction between your responsibility and theirs is one of the most liberating things to internalize, because so much of the suffering that comes from being affected by others' opinions comes from an invisible belief that their pain is your fault, that their disappointment makes you wrong, that their disapproval means you have failed. But disapproval is not a verdict, and disappointment is not a crime. When you are clear about your boundaries, you can receive someone's disappointment with compassion without allowing it to destabilize your sense of having made the right choice. The fourth component of stability is a regular practice of return. By this, we mean the practice of returning regularly to yourself, to your own center, to a state of relative quiet and presence beneath the noise of daily life. This can take many forms: meditation, walking in silence, time in nature, journaling, any practice that regularly takes you out of the stream of stimulus and response and allows you to simply be, simply exist, simply notice what is present without needing to fix it or change it. This practice matters more than it might seem, because most people spend almost their entire lives moving outward, toward tasks, toward other people, toward goals, toward demands. And there is very little movement inward. Very little time simply being in your own company. And when you are not in the habit of returning to yourself, the self can feel unfamiliar, foreign, and then external events seem even more defining, because there is nothing internal that feels solid enough to stand on. A regular practice of return builds that solid ground, not dramatically, not overnight, but slowly, through repetition. A sense of inner presence develops, a sense of being somewhere inside yourself that is not entirely defined by what is happening around you. And from that place, that quiet, present, grounded place, the world looks different, not less challenging, not less real, but less totalizing. You can feel the difficulty without being entirely consumed by it, because there is a part of you that is not the difficulty. There is a word that gets misunderstood in conversations about emotional resilience, and that word is detachment. When people hear detachment, they often hear coldness, distance, not caring, a kind of emotional armoring that keeps the world at bay. They imagine someone who is untouched by beauty, unmoved by love, indifferent to pain, and they recoil. Because that is not a way of living, that is a way of surviving. But real detachment is something entirely different. Real detachment is not the absence of caring. It is the absence of compulsive clinging. It is not a closed door. It is an open hand. Let's think about what it means to hold something with an open hand. When you hold something tightly, with a clenched fist, with desperate grip, several things happen. You can feel it, yes, but you cannot feel it fully because your focus is divided between the thing itself and the effort of holding on. And the tighter you hold, the more the holding becomes the experience rather than the thing itself. And if the thing changes, if it moves or shifts or tries to leave, the tightening becomes panic. Because losing it feels like losing something essential. When you hold something with an open hand, with a relaxed and attentive presence, you are fully in contact with it. You can feel its texture, its weight, its reality. You are not distracted by the effort of holding, and if it changes or moves or needs to go, your hand is already open. You can let it pass. You have not made its permanence the condition of your peace. This is what healthy detachment looks like. It is full presence without desperate clinging. It is genuine care without making the outcome of that caring the condition of your wholeness. You can love deeply and still hold lightly. You can invest fully in your work without making its success the proof of your worth. You can desire something genuinely without making its arrival the price of your happiness. This distinction between caring and clinging, between loving and depending, between hoping and demanding, is subtle, but it changes everything. Think about the difference between enjoying someone's company and needing them to be a certain way in order to feel okay. Both can look like caring from the outside, but they feel entirely different from the inside. In the first, there is spaciousness. In the second, there is pressure. In the first, the relationship is a source of joy. In the second, the relationship is a source of constant monitoring. Is it right? Is it safe? Is it secure? The need to control how something turns out in order to feel okay is not love. It is fear wearing love's clothes. And the way to move from fear-based holding to love-based holding is not to care less. It is to trust more, to trust in yourself, that you can survive change, loss, disappointment, impermanence, to trust in the nature of things, that what is meant to stay will stay, and what isn't will leave regardless of how tightly you hold. Detachment in the healthy sense also applies to your relationship with other people's behavior. One of the most common sources of emotional suffering is the expectation that other people will behave in certain ways, will be fair, will be kind, will be consistent, will be reasonable, and the resulting pain when they don't. People will not always be fair. They will not always be kind. They will act from their own fears and wounds and limitations. They will sometimes disappoint you, and sometimes hurt you, and sometimes behave in ways that make no sense to you at all. This is not a tragedy. It is the nature of other people. They are not here to meet your expectations. They are navigating their own interior lives as best they can. And while you can communicate your needs and hold boundaries and choose who you spend your time with, You cannot make other people be different from what they are, and spending your emotional energy in resistance to what people actually are, rather than accepting the reality of who they are, is one of the most exhausting ways to live. Acceptance here does not mean approval. It does not mean tolerating what is harmful. It means releasing the grip of the demand that things be different from what they are. It means acknowledging this is what this person is like. This is what this situation is. And from that clear-eyed acknowledgement, choosing how you want to move. Sometimes the movement is toward. Sometimes it is away. But the movement comes from clarity and choice, not from the ongoing suffering of resisting what is real. The practice of detachment is also about your relationship with your own thoughts and feelings. You are not your thoughts. You are the one who observes them. This sounds like a spiritual idea, and it is. But it is also a very practical one, because when you identify completely with every thought you have, when you believe that because a thought is present it must be true, it must be responded to, it must be resolved immediately, you give every thought the power to destabilize you. But when you can observe a thought as a thought, when you can notice I am having the thought that everything is going wrong, rather than everything is going wrong, you create distance, not emotional distance, but cognitive distance. The thought is present, you are aware of it, but you are not inside it. You have not merged with it. This is the same capacity that applies to emotions. You are not your emotions. You are the one experiencing them. There is something in you. Something steady, something observing, something continuous, that is larger than any particular feeling you are having right now. And when you can find that perspective, when you can locate the observer, the feeling becomes something you are having rather than something you are. From that place, even the most difficult emotions become manageable, not easy, not painless, but manageable, because they have the quality of weather, real, affecting, present, rather than the quality of identity. You do not have to become your storms. You can learn to watch them from the center. Calmness is often misunderstood as the absence of emotion, as blankness or flatness, or the kind of stillness that looks, from the outside, like nothing is happening inside. But real calmness is not the absence of something. It is the presence of something. It is the active, practiced presence of internal stability in the middle of external noise. It is the person in the meeting who hears sharp criticism and takes a breath before speaking. It is the parent who, in the middle of a child's storm, stays soft and steady. It is the leader who receives bad news without broadcasting their panic. It is the friend who can hear something painful without immediately reaching for a solution or a distraction. These people are not feeling nothing. In many cases, they are feeling a great deal, but they have developed, over time, through practice, through difficulty survived, a relationship with their own inner state that allows them to be in it without being overwhelmed by it. And this is a capacity, not a personality trait, not something you either have or you don't. It is something that is built. So how is it built, specifically, in the heat of a difficult moment? The first thing, the thing that everything else depends on, is breathing. This sounds obvious, almost too simple to be transformative, but the breath is the only part of your autonomic nervous system that you can consciously control, and controlling it, deliberately slowing it, deliberately deepening it, directly signals the nervous system to shift out of a fight or flight state. When you are triggered, your breathing changes. It becomes faster, shallower, higher in the chest. This pattern of breathing actually reinforces the state of activation. It tells the body, yes, we are in danger, keep the systems engaged. When you breathe slowly and deeply, from the belly, not the chest, you interrupt that signal. You are telling the body, through the one channel you can control, it is okay, we are safe, we can slow down. This is not a metaphor. This is a physiological fact, and it works. It works even when you don't believe it will. It works even in the middle of intense emotion. because it is operating on a level beneath belief. The breath is your most reliable tool for creating the space between feeling and reacting. And the good news is that it is always available. You always have access to it. No matter where you are, no matter what is happening, you can take a breath. In the middle of a difficult conversation, a breath. Before you respond to a message that has triggered you, a breath. In the moment when you feel the tightening in your chest and the heat behind your eyes, a breath. Not to suppress what is happening, not to perform composure, but to create just enough space to stay with yourself rather than being pulled entirely into the reaction. The second thing that supports calmness in difficult moments is the practice of labeling. When you can name what you are feeling, even just internally, even if you never say it aloud, something in the brain shifts. The emotional intensity decreases. Not dramatically, but enough to make a difference. Instead of being inside the anger, you say to yourself, I am feeling angry. Instead of being swallowed by the fear, you say, I notice fear. This is hurt. This is shame. This is the familiar feeling of rejection. This labeling practice, technically known as affect labeling in psychological research, activates the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational thinking and response regulation. It reduces the dominance of the amygdala, the part of the brain driving the emotional reaction. In other words, the simple act of naming the feeling creates neurological change. This is why talking about feelings helps. This is why writing about difficult experiences leads to better emotional outcomes. Not because the feelings disappear, but because moving them through language changes how the brain processes them. So in the difficult moment, name it. Not out loud necessarily, but internally. I am feeling this. I know what this is. It has a name. It is not infinite. It will not last forever. The third element of sustained calmness is what might be called a grounding anchor. An anchor is something specific. A physical sensation, a phrase, an image, a memory, that reliably connects you to your sense of self when you are at risk of being pulled out of it. For some people it is the physical sensation of their feet on the floor. In a difficult moment, you notice the pressure of the floor beneath you. Solid, real, present. And for a moment, that sensation pulls you back into your body and out of the spiral in your head. For others it is a phrase, something that has meaning and which, when repeated internally, orients them back to their values or their steadiness. I have handled hard things. I can remain present. I do not have to react right now. For others it is a connection to something larger, a sense of perspective that makes the present moment feel less totalizing. This is one moment. This is not my entire life. 5 years from now, what will this have been? Whatever your anchor is, it needs to be something that works for you specifically, something you have practiced using in calmer moments, so that it is available in the difficult ones. Because in the middle of a triggered state, you cannot construct a new strategy from scratch. Your capacity for complex problem solving is diminished. What you need is something simple and reliable, something the body and mind already recognize, something that says, come back. You are here. You are okay. The fourth element is time. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a difficult moment is nothing. Not yet. If you are in a conversation that is escalating and you can feel yourself moving toward a reaction that you will regret, the most effective response may be to say, I need a moment, or I want to respond thoughtfully and I'm not ready to yet, or simply to say less rather than more until you have had time to return to yourself. This is not avoidance. It is not cowardice. It is wisdom. It is the recognition that a response given in the middle of a triggered state is rarely your best response, and that waiting, even briefly, changes the quality of what comes next. Many of the things people say in difficult moments that they later regret were said because they did not give themselves permission to pause, because they felt that responding immediately was required, because silence felt like concession. But there is nothing weak about choosing your moment. And there is nothing weak about saying, I am not going to respond to this right now. What you are actually saying is, my response matters enough to be considered, and I matter enough to be heard in a way that represents who I actually am, not who I become in a reaction. The fifth, and perhaps most important element of sustained calmness is what might be called perspective widening. When you are inside a difficult moment, when it is immediate and loud and pressing, it can feel like the whole world, like this is everything. Like the outcome of this moment determines everything that comes after. But almost nothing is as large as it feels in the heat of it. A deliberate expansion of perspective, even just imagining yourself looking back at this moment from a week from now, a month from now, a year from now, can shift the emotional scale significantly. What felt like everything begins to become one thing that is happening. Not dismissing it, not minimizing it, just returning it to its actual proportion within the larger landscape of your life. And within that larger landscape, you have navigated difficult things before. You have been here before in some form, and you have survived. You have found your way through. The story continued, and it will continue from this moment too. Calmness, practiced consistently over time, becomes not just a skill but a state. A default setting that is more stable, more grounded, more spacious than before. You do not become unaffected, but you become less controlled by what affects you. The reactions become less automatic. The recovery becomes faster. The capacity to choose your response grows, and slowly, the experience of being in the world begins to feel less like being tossed around and more like moving through. With intention, with steadiness, with yourself, you have come a long way in this audiobook. Not in the sense of distance traveled, but in the sense of depth reached. What you have been exploring here is not a technique or a formula. It is a different way of living inside your own experience. A different relationship with the world that moves through you and around you every day. You began by recognizing something that many people are afraid to admit, that things affect you, that you feel deeply, that the world gets in, and sometimes the getting in is painful. And you have moved through an understanding of why the past shapes the present, why certain things reach past your composure and into something older, something more tender, why the mind amplifies pain and why overthinking, for all its busyness, does not bring peace. Why reactions are not the same as responses, why stability is not rigidity, why detachment is not coldness. And now, at the end of this listening, you have something you did not have at the beginning. You have a map. Not a map of someone else's interior, a map of your own. You know more clearly what destabilizes you and why. You know the shapes your triggers take. You know how your mind tends to amplify and spiral. You know the gap between feeling and reacting. And you know that the gap is yours to inhabit. You know that stability is not built in a single dramatic transformation. It is built in small moments. Moments of choosing breath over reaction, of naming the feeling rather than becoming it, of letting go of the demand that things be different from what they are, of returning to yourself after you have been pulled away. These moments accumulate. They compound. They become, over time, a different way of moving through the world. There will still be hard days. There will still be moments when something happens and you feel it in every cell of your body. There will still be times when the old patterns assert themselves, when you react before you have thought, when the overthinking starts, when the old wound is touched and the old pain rises. This is not failure. This is humanness. The measure of your growth is not the absence of difficult moments. It is what you do inside them. It is how quickly you return to yourself. It is the increasing frequency with which you catch yourself earlier, respond more deliberately, recover more completely. And over time, not all at once, but gradually, reliably, the world will feel different. Not easier, necessarily, but less total, less overwhelming. Less like something that is happening to you, and more like something you are moving through with awareness and choice. You will begin to notice that the things that once consumed you for days pass through in hours, that the comments that once left you fragile become things you can hear and set down, that the uncertainty that once felt unbearable becomes something you can hold with more grace, that the difficult people in your life lose their grip on your internal state, that your sense of who you are becomes less dependent on what the world reflects back at you. This is not because you have become someone who doesn't care. It is because you have become someone who cares with more wisdom, someone who knows the difference between what deserves your energy and what does not, between what is worth carrying and what can be put down. That is not indifference. That is discernment. And discernment, practiced with kindness, is one of the most powerful forms of self-respect. There is something worth saying about the world you will carry this learning back into. It will not become easier. The criticism will still come. The rejection will still sting. The difficult people will still be there. Life will still contain loss and uncertainty and the full weight of being human. But you will meet it differently. You will meet it with more ground beneath you, more space inside you, more trust in your own capacity to navigate what comes. And gradually, you will discover something that cannot be fully understood from the outside. You will discover that the equanimity you sought, the stillness beneath the storm, was never something you had to find outside yourself. It was always there, beneath the noise, beneath the reactions, beneath the old patterns and the learned fears. It was always there, waiting for you to become quiet enough to feel it. Not everything deserves your energy. Not everything deserves your time. Not everything deserves access to your peace. And the moment you begin to truly understand that, the moment that understanding moves from thought into the body, into the way you breathe and walk and respond and return to yourself, you begin to feel something you may not have felt in a long time. You begin to feel free, not free from the world, not free from feeling, not free from difficulty or loss or the inevitable pain of being alive, but free from the grip of it, free from the compulsion to let every wave carry you away. You can feel the wave. You can stand in it. You can let it move through you. And when it passes, and it always passes, you will still be there standing, rooted, steady yourself,